lake. Legend has it that early in his career, Arthur broke the sword he'd pulled from the stone, and that a magical water spirit, the Lady of the Lake, replaced it with the mythical blade Excalibur.
Now that sounds completely make-believe. However, what is interesting is, according to Roman writers, the Celtic people had a tradition that during a funeral rite, a king's prized possession, very often his sword, would be thrown into a sacred lake, river or stretch of water as an offering to a water goddess.
So it's likely that both the sword in the stone and the Lady of the Lake were fanciful reimaginings of relatively common Dark Age rituals. The supernatural powers of Merlin and his malicious antithesis Morgana also seem rather implausible. But there are similar likely explanations for them, although they're less rooted in reality than mythology. Merlin is probably based on a figure named Merlin, a wild man imported from Welsh folklore.
The original Merlin, if there was one, is a generation at least later than Arthur. He's a warrior who goes mad and acquires in his madness the powers of prophecy, which is a great story, but it's not anywhere near the Arthurian legend in time.
Morgana is probably derived from equally unconnected mythical roots.
There was an ancient Celtic goddess called the Morrigan. She was basically a goddess of witchcraft, if you like, and it could have been that the Morrigan somehow got woven into the King Arthur story and became the story of Morgan le Fay or Morgana.
The magical aspects of the King Arthur story were probably lifted directly from popular folklore. So is there anything left to the legend that we can't explain away as a popular medieval add-on? Once we strip all embellishments, we get down to the very core of King Arthur, a hard-hitting Dark Age warrior. The evidence implies that he lived around 500 AD. He was a military leader who fought the historical Battle of Mount Badon and stopped a devastating invasion. But do these sketchy details describe any of our three candidates? We start with the Battle of Mount Badon. There are no eyewitness accounts that put anyone named Arthur at the scene, but there is one man whose story seems to revolve around the defeat of the Saxons. The tale is told in a book written in the 6th century. It describes a great leader who rallied the Britons and beat back the Saxons. His name is Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Roman. At least one ancient text credits him with the victory at Mount Badon, but beyond that we know nothing about him, at least nothing that relates to the Arthurian legend. But there's another Roman whose military exploits might have been mixed up with Aurelianus's story. Artorius Castus, Latin for Arthur, was a Roman officer stationed in Britain in the 2nd century. That makes him about 400 years too young to have been fighting the Saxons. But over the centuries, some very Arthur-like legends have come to be connected with Artorius. The reason for this is his association with a unit of cavalry soldiers known as Sarmatians. Dr. Linda A. Malcor, a specialist on Arthurian studies, sheds some light on the matter.
And they wore scale armor. They had long swords that they fought with from horseback, and they flew a Pendragon banner, a dragon-head banner, at the head of their units when they went into battle. And so they looked very, very much like medieval knights.
The Sarmatians are also known to have worshipped a sword stuck in the ground during some religious rites. Furthermore, Sarmatian legend tells of a fearsome warrior who wielded an unstoppable sword, with connections to a magical water ritual, which sounds a lot like Excalibur. The name, the look, and the sword all seem to point to King Arthur. There's just that inconvenient 400-year gap. But not everyone agrees that King Arthur was a Roman import. The grand old man of Arthurian lore, Geoffrey Ashe, began to study Arthur 50 years ago. And after decades of sifting through ancient evidence, he thinks he's got a pretty good idea of who Arthur was. He puts his money on a Dark Age ruler named Thomas. This High King is our second candidate, and he has some serious credentials.
He does quite a lot of the things Arthur is supposed to have done.
Historical documents prove that he was around at the right time. But for Ash, the critical element is Thomas's famous expedition to what is now modern-day France. He went there on a rescue mission, helping one of the last Roman emperors to fight off a barbarian army.
He brought this king over from Britain with a fair-sized army across the Channel, and they fought against the Goths.
On the surface, this seems unimportant, but King Arthur supposedly did a fair bit of travelling abroad as well, and not just anywhere. Like Thomas, he travelled to France. Thomas's campaign ultimately ended in defeat, the result of a deadly betrayal. And much the same thing supposedly happened to King Arthur. According to legend, he left a knight named Mordred to guard Camelot. But Mordred was a double agent. He was the son of the sorceress Morgana. It was the traitorous Mordred who seized the throne and dealt Arthur his mortal wound. This injury forced Arthur to depart for the legendary Avalon. And here again there's an intersection between Arthur and Thomas. Shortly after he was betrayed, Thomas disappeared, and he was last sighted in an intriguing location.
When you have last glimpsed him historically, he is on his way into the area we call Burgundy, and in Burgundy there is a real town called Avalon.
Is this Avalon perhaps the real-world inspiration for the mythical island? Thomas's story bears a striking resemblance to the Arthur legend. The only piece that doesn't seem to fit is the name. No matter how you look at it, Thomas just isn't Arthur. But Ash has an explanation for this.
He is recorded as Thomas, which apparently is a title. It means what the Irish call the High King, the Supreme King.
If Thomas was just his job description, is it possible that his name was Arthur? Could Thomas have been the historical basis for the legendary king? It's possible, but surely the real King Arthur should be a homegrown hero who made his name fighting in England rather than France. Graham Phillips is inclined to agree, and he believes that you don't have to look across the sea to find proof of Arthur. It's all in the name. For that reason, he's placing his bets on a 5th century king who may have ruled over one of the last British-controlled cities of the time.
Now, during